After this lecture, you should be able to draw out the voluntary control of the skeletal muscles of the face and body. And it's important to know these pathways because if you have injury somewhere in the pathway, that results in weakness or paralysis. And if a patient presents with weakness or paralysis and you know the pathway, you can figure out, get a pretty good idea about where the injury is located. So let's start and name the whole system the cortical and descending motor system. And the four component parts that are really important to understand how this works is the upper motor neuron, the lower motor neuron, neuromuscular junction, and skeletal muscle. So let's start with the upper motor neuron, which is the first part of the pathway, and that is located in the cerebral cortex, which is where the cortical part of the name comes from, and that's specifically located in the frontal lobe. So we'll write that in here, the frontal lobe. And that upper motor neuron has to descend down and contact the lower motor neuron, which is the second neuron in the pathway. And that lower motor neuron is going to be found in two locations, either the brain stem or the spinal cord. So we'll write that in here. Brain stem, which is either the midbrain, pons, or medulla. And you can also find these in the spinal cord. Now that lower motor neuron is going to go and travel to the skeletal muscle where it's going to release a very important neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. We'll abbreviate that ACH. And that acetylcholine is going to be released into this specialized junction, which is the terminal end of the lower motor neuron, and the space until the skeletal muscle surface where we have receptors for acetylcholine called nicotinic cholinergic receptors. We're going to abbreviate those receptors N for nicotinic, sub M for muscle, and cholinergic because acetylcholine is the ligand for that receptor. Now, a very important part of this system is that the upper motor neuron in general has to cross the midline, we call that a decussation, to contact the lower motor neuron. What that means is that the cerebral cortex on one side has control of the muscles on the other side, the contralateral side. Most of our muscles are regulated this way. There are some exceptions like the forehead, the pharynx, the larynx, and even the tongue, which has bilateral control. But in general, we have to have an upper motor neuron that's going to have to cross somewhere in the pathway to get to the other side so it can contact its lower motor neuron. So here we've drawn out all the important components of the descending cortical motor system, starting with the frontal lobe up top rostrally, the posterior limb of the internal capsule, the brain stem, which is made up of the midbrain, pons, and medulla, the spinal cord, the cervical cord, thoracic cord, lumbar, and sacral cord. We also have over here the muscles that we're going to draw the pathways out for. So we have the face split up into forehead muscles and lower face muscles. And then we have the upper extremities and lower extremity muscles. We have the left, we'll call it arm muscles, and left leg muscles. So we're going to draw out for each of these groups of muscles the pathway starting with the upper motor neuron going to the lower motor neuron. So let's start for the leg muscles. The left leg, we know the upper motor neuron has to start on the right side. So what we'll do is we'll put in the cell body for the upper motor neuron, and notice that I'm putting it in a very specific location in the frontal lobe. It actually is in the medial part of the frontal lobe because there's a map called the motor homunculus which has the different regions of the body. And the most medial part of the map is the lower extremities. So I'm going to write in here leg. Okay, so there's the cell body for the upper motor neuron. And the axons of the upper motor neuron are going to descend through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. From there, it's going to enter the brainstem. And in the brainstem, it's really important to understand that these upper motor neuron axons are going to descend through the ventral part of the brainstem. So for the midbrain, the ventral part of the midbrain is called the crus cerebri. So we're going to go down through there. Now we're going to enter the ventral pons, which is called the basis pontis. And then we're going to continue down into the medulla. The ventral part of the medulla is called the pyramid. And then at the very, very bottom of the medulla, the caudal medulla, there is the crossing of the upper motor neurons, and that's called the decussation of the pyramids. And so we need to have this upper motor neuron cross the midline. And now we're going to enter the spinal cord. In the spinal cord, the upper motor neurons descend down through a very important tract called the lateral corticospinal tract. And as they descend down, we're going to go down through the cervical cord, the thoracic spinal cord, and then we're going to get to the region of the spinal cord that is involved in controlling the lower extremities. And typically the way we think about this is lumbar 2 to about sacral 2 spinal cord innervates the lower extremities. So we're going to have this terminate in the lumbar spinal cord and activate the lower motor neuron there in the spinal cord in a very specific location called the anterior or ventral horn, excite that lower motor neuron, and that lower motor neuron then is going to exit the spinal cord as a spinal nerve. In this case, it's a lumbar spinal nerve. And then remember that nerve terminal of the lower motor neuron releases that important neurotransmitter, acetylcholine. So we'll draw that in here. ACH. And remember, ACH activates receptors on the muscle called nicotinic receptors. And remember, those are N for nicotinic, M for skeletal muscle. And that junction was the neuromuscular junction. And once the muscle is has those receptors activated, there's machinery in the skeletal muscle that engage in skeletal muscle contraction. The muscle shortens, and we have movement. So that would be the pathway for the left leg muscles. We start up there at the upper motor neuron, and it goes all the way down, crosses, activates the lower motor neuron, which then goes off and controls the left leg muscles. Now let's take a look at what we would have if we were looking at the left arm muscles. So for the arm, we're going to again start in the contralateral cortex, the right frontal lobe, the primary motor cortex, and we're going to move a little more laterally in the map, that motor homunculus, and we'll write in here, arm. So this is the cell body that's going to be controlling the left arm muscle. And the upper motor neuron, just like before, is going to descend down through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, through the midbrain crus cerebri, through the basis pontis, through the medullary pyramid. It's going to decussate just like the lower extremity upper motor neurons that we had showing for the leg. It's going to cross at the very bottom of the medulla in that decussation of the pyramids. And then it's going to go and descend down in the lateral corticospinal tract on the same side, just like we had before. But the difference here now is that the cervical cord, about C5 to T1, is the spinal cord segments that innervate the upper extremities. So what we need to have here then is this upper motor neuron ends somewhere, for our example, in the cervical cord and excite that lower motor neuron there higher up in the spinal cord than we had for the lower extremity. And just like we had before, the lower motor neuron is going to exit. It's going to release acetylcholine just like we had before onto a nicotinic receptor. So the acetylcholine binding the nicotinic receptor is the same process every time for our neuromuscular junctions. There's going to be any case where that doesn't occur. And so now we can see that there's some similarities and some differences between these two pathways. The upper motor neuron moves a little bit more laterally in the map. After that, it pretty much travels very, very closely with the other upper motor neurons, and then it crosses the same way, and it just the only difference at the terminal end is that it ends higher up in the spinal cord. Now we would call collectively, these two examples, part of what we would say is the corticospinal tract. We're starting in the cortex, and then we're ending in the spinal cord. And that is one important piece of this system that we're drawing out. The other part is going to be for control of muscles up in the head. And we're going to use the facial muscle, the muscles of facial expression to draw out that pathway. So what we can do in this case is we'll start with the lower face muscles. So we're going to move even more laterally in the map. So we'll call this the lower face, something like that. And it's going to descend just like we had before. Going to go down through the posterior limb of the internal capsule. It's going to go down through the ventral midbrain, which is called the crus cerebri. It's going to go down through the ventral pons called the basis pontis. But now this is the difference. The cell bodies of the lower motor neurons for the face are actually found in the very bottom part of the pons. It's called the caudal pontine tegmentum. And so what we need then is for this upper motor neuron, when it gets to the very bottom part of the pons, now is where it's going to cross. And it's going to decussate. And it's going to activate cell body that's in the caudal pontine tegmentum. And then that lower motor neuron axon is going to go off and release acetylcholine on these lower face muscles. So here's acetylcholine again. Here is the skeletal muscle nicotinic cholinergic receptor. So now you can see that, again, the starting spot, it's in the frontal lobe, it's a little more lateral, it travels along with the other corticospinal tract fibers, but then it just ends higher up, in this case the lower brainstem, the lower pons. So finally we're going to look at the left forehead muscles. Now we're going to still be in a similar location in that motor homunculus map. I'm just going to put it right next to our lower face. I'm just going to write FH for forehead. And those fibers are going to go and descend down through the posterior limb of the internal capsule, just like we had before. Going to go down through the midbrain crus cerebri, the basis pontis. And of course, we would expect that these upper motor neurons here are going to have to cross and activate the cell bodies right here in this nucleus called the facial-motor nucleus, just like we had before. And so we can have this going down and activating some cell bodies that are in this nucleus, and then those guys would come out and release acetylcholine onto a muscle nicotinic cholinergic receptor. Now here is a very important difference from what we've had before for the other three examples. The lower motor neurons that control the forehead are special because they're controlled by two upper motor neurons. So we just drew in the one that we would have expected, the one from the contralateral frontal lobe, but there's also one on the other side. I'm just going to put it over here on the left side. I'll call that FH for forehead. And that goes down similarly and also contacts those lower motor neurons that go to the forehead. So this is an example of bilateral control of the lower motor neuron. The reason why this is so important is because if I damage one of the upper motor neurons that are going to the forehead, the other side is capable of activating the lower motor neuron and contracting those forehead muscles. That's very important because the only way I can get my forehead muscles to be weak with a focal lesion is if the lesion is right here affecting where the forehead muscle, lower motor neurons, and lower face motor neurons are together. And that actually is an important structure. This structure where they're together here, I'm just going to group them together. In this case, this would be the left cranial nerve 7, which we call the facial nerve. And if I have a lesion in the facial nerve, all these muscles get weak on that side. If I have a lesion over here on the other side affecting the upper motor neurons that are going to the face, only the lower face is going to be weak on the other side. And that's a really important distinction between these two types of lesions. We call these an upper motor neuron pattern of weakness for the face versus a lower motor neuron pattern of weakness for the face. And just looking at the forehead muscles is a very important distinction between those two types of lesions. We also can label over here, right where the lower motor neurons are coming off to the left arm, that would be the left, in this case, cervical spinal nerves. In this case, we'll call this a spinal nerve. And for the left leg, this would be the left lumbar spinal nerve. And we can see that if I had lesions specifically in those locations, I would get specific weakness in each of those locations. So if I had a left cervical spinal nerve lesion, I would have weakness of my left arm on that side. If I had a left lumbar spinal nerve lesion, I would have weakness in the left leg muscle specifically because they're going right there to those muscles. So knowing where these upper motor neurons and lower motor neurons are located, where the decussations are, and knowing if there's any bilateral control is very important in localizing lesions. And we're going to be discussing, when we do some examples of lesions, we'll be applying these pathways to figure those sorts of things out. So it's very important to understand the anatomical locations of these structures we've been talking about, which we first started out drawing in the boxes. So we have horizontal cross sections taken through the brain stem and specific spinal cord segments. So up top here, we see that we have the midbrain, horizontal cross section, ventral is down, dorsal is up, and we have right and left labeled. Remember, the ventral part of the brainstem are where the upper motor neurons descend down through. So the ventral midbrain is called the crus cerebri, abbreviated here CC. And we have a left and we have a right. Just below that, we have the pons. Remember, the ventral part of the pons is called the basis pontis. And in the very, very bottom part of the pons, we call that the caudal pons. In the back part, which is called the pontine tegmentum, we see here labeled and indicated in these dark colored in circles, the facial motor nucleus, which contains the lower motor neuron cell bodies, which go off and control skeletal muscles in the face, the forehead and lower face. If we go down a little lower, we have the medulla, and the ventral part of the medulla is called the pyramid, and that is labeled right here, PYR. And just below the medulla, we transition into the spinal cord. The upper part of the spinal cord is called the cervical spinal cord. And we see for these horizontal cross sections through the spinal cord that there's an H of gray matter in the center here. And in the anterior part of the H of gray matter, these horn-like structures, we call those anterior horns or ventral horns, those are where the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons that are going to go off to the muscles that are controlled by the cervical spinal cord. Remember, we talked about C5 to about T1 are the spinal cord segments that control the upper extremities. So in this case, these would be lower motor neurons that are going to go off and control arm muscles, for example. If we go lower, we now have a cross-section through the lumbar spinal cord. Again, we have the H of gray matter. We have in the anterior region, the anterior horns, we have the cell bodies that are going to be going off and controlling the lower extremities. Remember, about L2 to S2 are the spinal cord segments that control the lower extremities. And also notice that in the horizontal cross sections through the spinal cord, we have indicated here at these circles the tracts that contain the upper motor neurons that have already crossed in the decussation of the pyramids and are now on the same side as the muscle they're going to be going off to. And we see here we have the lateral corticospinal tracts that are right there located in a dorsal lateral region of the spinal cord, white matter. It's very important to understand these cross sections because there are other structures that are nearby these structures. And if those structures are injured, and we have injury in the crus cerebri or the basis pontis or the pyramid or the spinal cord, that can give us what we call neighborhood signs, which help us further localize the lesion and be able to pinpoint where the damage might be. We'll go over some of those examples in a little bit. So for example, in the midbrain, cranial nerve 3, the oculomotor nerve, actually exits ventrally right by the crus cerebri. So if, for example, we had a weakness on one side and a finding of a cranial nerve 3 lesion, that would help us pinpoint that the crus cerebri is the location causing the weakness. Another example would be the abducens nerve, cranial nerve 6, also courses ventrally through the basis pontis, next to the basis pontis, and if I had a cranial nerve 6 lesion along with my weakness, then that would help me pinpoint that maybe the lesion's in the pons. Another example would be the medulla. Cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve, also goes out ventrally in between this structure here called the olive and the pyramid, and if I had injury to the pyramid, it could also damage the hypoglossal nerve and give me tongue weakness, which would help me localize the lesion to the medulla. So that's why it's really important to know these horizontal cross sections and know what other structures are going nearby, because we might get these other findings called neighborhood signs, which help us further localize the lesion. So now we're going to apply what we learned, and remember, lesions in the corticospinal or cortical bulbar system, those are the upper motor neurons that go to the brainstem, lesions in there are going to cause weakness. Remember, lesions of the upper motor neuron, cell bodies or axons, the lower motor neuron, cell bodies or axons, neuromuscular junction or muscle, lesions in any of those locations can cause decreased muscle strength or weakness. The extreme form of that would be paralysis. Now, it's important to recognize that the upper motor neuron cell bodies, where they start, where they cross, where the lower motor neuron cell bodies are located, where they're coming out, where they're going, is all very important in localizing lesions. We can have lesions that are focal. Right there you can point to it. We can have lesions that are diffuse, that are selectively taking out different parts of this pathway. And of course, we can always have multifocal lesions. Let's do an example of a patient with a left-sided weakness of the lower face, arm, and leg. What we want to do to figure this out is how high can the lesion be and how low can the lesion be. Now, if we think about how high the lesion can be, we know that in the frontal lobe, there's the arm, leg, and face all in the motor homunculus map. And if I took out all of those neurons in that frontal lobe on the contralateral side, in this case it'd be the right side, that would be one possibility for where the lesion could be to cause this patient's weakness. If I go down a little bit lower, in between the frontal lobe and the posterior limb and the internal capsule is a corona radiata, so I certainly could have a lesion there, the right corona radiata. I also could have the lesion where all those upper motor neuron axons are all traveling together, very tightly packed in the posterior limb of the internal capsule. That would be another possibility, the right posterior limb of the internal capsule. If I go down a little bit lower, remember in the crus cerebri on the right side, I still have all those upper motor neuron axons traveling together. So that certainly could be a possibility. And even in the basis pontis on the right side, just before the facial motor nucleus, which is located in the caudal pontine tegmentum, if I have the lesion in the basis pontis just above there, I can take out the face, arm, and leg upper motor neurons all together, giving me this hemiparesis on the left side. So that would be the range of possibilities for this particular patient. And depending on the neighborhood sign, I can further localize if it's in any of these particular spots. Keep in mind that if the face wasn't affected, I could actually go down lower into the right medullary pyramid and on the left lateral corticospinal tract up until about the high cervical cord, about C4. If the leg was affected only, then I can continue on and go down even lower on the left side to the left lateral corticospinal tract in the upper lumbar spinal cord. I want to point out one other thing. Notice in this case that the patient's lower face is affected and the forehead is spared. Remember, the forehead lower motor neurons are bilaterally innervated, which means that if I damage the upper motor neurons on one side, the other side is sufficient to control the lower motor neurons going to the forehead, which is why the forehead is spared in this particular case. And that is a very important concept, that when there's bilateral innervation, damage on one side doesn't really cause a deficit. And now you should be able to draw out the cortical and descending motor pathways for the face and arm, the cortical bulbar and corticospinal pathways, and localized lesions in these pathways that cause weakness.